Everybody, welcome back. This is part 2 of Atlantic Revolutions and their echoes. In the first part, we were able to look at the ingredients of the revolution and the 3 main ingredients that showed political, ideological, as well as economic and social ingredients that altogether were perfect kindling to ignite the revolutions. And we looked at that through the American Revolution. But this lecture, we're going to briefly look at it compared to the American Revolution and what happened in the French Revolution, and then really spend a lot of time in what happened with the Haitian Revolution and how that plays a role in the young United States. Why are we talking about the Haitian Revolution in a U.S. history class? Well, a lot has to do with it, and it really brings together what's happening around the Atlantic world with these revolutions, these ingredients playing a role, and also revolutionary ideals and realities that play throughout the 18th, 19th, and even through to the 21st century today. So let's check it out, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the brainstorm at the end. Now, we don't have enough time to go into all the tenets of what makes the French Revolution, but if you break it down and you look at it like a house that's crumbling like this one, and let's say this was the American colonies. It was economically a disaster, socially not the best place. You wouldn't, I don't know, maybe you'd want to live in this place. That's cool. Politically, ideologically, it seems great, but it has some problems, and we need to uphold that. The idea that a home needs to be a certain way and needs to keep you warm and keep you secure and safe. This isn't it. It needs change. So the American Revolution would look to this house as to restore it. The American Revolution looked at the colonies and wanted to restore. It didn't set out to abolish everything. It set out to restore and to change things that they felt wasn't being upheld. It gradually led into the Declaration of Independence and a new country. And so that took root and grew with those radical ideas. But at the end of it, it became new owners, right? You have the United States creating its new government. So that's the new owners. But a lot of ways, the foundation and the walls remained the same. You still have the educated elite that were there, that were in power already, that had a very strong voice. Those gained more power. The U.S. Constitution creates a balance between the elite's power and limits the rest. Those were things that were already kind of in place, but just kind of reinforced, if you will. So reinforcing and restoring and creating something new, but still has elements of the past. In a lot of ways, the French Revolution demolished the house. Think of it as if this was France on the eve of the French Revolution, bringing in a bulldozer and knocking it down completely and starting from scratch completely. By 1793, there's the Reign of Terror, and we're not going to get it all into it, but everything of the ancient regime, everything before the French Revolution was destroyed, and a new house was built, a new government was built. This creates the Reign of Terror. That creates such turmoil, just absolutely abolishing religion, creating the House of Reason instead of a religious church. All these other ideas that come into play, and political. If you're against a certain political authority, bringing in the guillotine, which they thought was humane. We think of the guillotine today as such a barbaric thing, but in fact, before, in medieval times even, the people that were beheaded were royalty. It was seen as the best way to die because it's a quick and way to do it. However, there's human error and also blunt objects, which makes it not so great. However, by mechanizing the thing, makes it and bringing equality that everyone has the right to die the way the elites do. So you have the guillotine come into play, right? So it takes out human error. It's sharp as long as you don't use it too often and keep the blade sharp. And it seems gruesome, but it's a pretty quick way of doing it. That's why even France did it well into the 20th century as a way of corporal punishment, because it was still seen as more humane, perhaps more humane if you want to argue about it, than some other ways of corporal punishment. That's another story. But at the bottom of it, what happens with France is a complete abolishment of whatever happens from before, new government, and that government leads the way to then change once again with the dictator of Napoleon Bonaparte. Now that's all happening in France. What's the ingredients? They all have the same ingredients. Definitely with the ideologies, right? So you have all the ideas of nationalism coming together, the ideas of liberty and personal freedoms. That is the foundation of the French Revolution, and also the taxes, because of the 7 Years' War, largely, those taxes was part of the thing, and the social power and structures all was meant to be changed. And their call and cry for freedom for all French subjects, and for everybody to have that. And that's what really guided the French Revolution. So what does that have to do with Haiti? Everything. So Haiti, known as Saint Dominique, was a major colonial holding of France. In fact, at the time, in the 1700s, there was 8,000 plantations on the island. And they had 40% of the world's production of sugar. 40%. And everyone's using sugar. It's expensive at the time. It's seen as a elite item, but everyone who had money, you would be buying sugar. You would also be buying coffee, much like today. I'm drinking coffee right now. Maybe some of you watching this, and half the world's production of this time came from this island. It was the bedrock of economic growth. Think of the United States colonies. Think of the American colonies, of how important they were for British finance. Saint Dominique was the same for France. The problem is, there were 500,000 slaves were there, and 40,000 whites. So the majority of the population, well more than the actual slave holders, were in fact the slaves themselves. So if you want to look at it here, if this is a good way to look at it, there's 4 different groups on this island. There were the slaves, that was the majority. And there was the gens de couleur, which was, and we'll talk about this. This is what the different principles of the revolution meant to everybody. But you have those of color, that are free, maybe mixed race, also petit blancs. So you have those that were poor, the poor whites, and you have the rich whites. When they heard of the French Revolution happening, and they've heard that, hey, the French are calling for freedom for all. We're French. We're speaking French. We have a French flag over the buildings, right? The government's French. Therefore, they just won freedom. That means we won freedom as well. Do you get me? So the slaves say, look, the French Revolution happened. They said freedom for all. That includes us. The gens de couleur, rights of man, equal treatment for all human beings, that includes us. And the colonies, they're saying, well, this is freedom for us, and we have the right to protect our property, which is the slaves. So it creates this tension between the slaves saying, look, our own preservation liberties are now free with the French Revolution. Those that are slave owners are saying, our rights are free, and we have the right to protect our private property. It creates turmoil. Creates tension. So the ideas and examples of the French Revolution sets in motion violence that engulfs the island for more than a decade, from 1791 all the way up to the reign of Napoleon in 1804. It's bloody, and it's a major slave revolt. In fact, it's the only real successful slave revolt. You might have heard of Spartacus during Roman times, but unfortunately, that wasn't successful for him, and he dies of crucifixion. But this was successful. It's triggered from the misinterpretation, or perhaps correct interpretation, thinking that the revolution in France put an end to slavery and that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, using Enlightenment ideals. So the slaves took that with them as their own battle cry, using Enlightenment ideals to create 500,000 slave revolt, burning down 1,000 plantations, creating warring factions between the gens de couleurs and the slaves. There's factions against the petits blancs, the poor whites, and also the rich whites, and all of them fighting each other essentially. And the British saw this as an opportunity as well. This was the richest island with the most amount of sugar coming out of one place, the most amount of coffee coming out of one place. Britain's at war with France and constantly at economic battle with France. This was a great opportunity for them to come in, to take control, and to make it themselves, a place for themselves, right? They just, by 1793, they've lost the British colonies in America. So now they could take over another successful colonial holdings of Saint Dominique. Are you with me? So British also send troops, and they're trying to take control of this region. So you have British troops, you have 500,000 slaves, you have the freed African Americans, and the freed African Haitians or Dominique. You have the Petit Blancs, you have the Grand Blancs, you have the poor, and they're all fighting together. So in comes one of the main leaders, a former slave himself, Toussaint Louverture. He's named this most likely because he had a big gap. We know he had a big gap in his teeth. And if you know what Louverture means, that means gap, means open. It means the gap. In music, there's the overture, so it's the gap between two different parts. So Toussaint Louverture maybe came from that physical appearance. And look at this. Look at how he uses the Enlightenment ideals. He says, I have undertaken vengeance, and I want liberty and equality, to reign in Saint Dominique. I am working to make that happen. Unite yourselves to us, brothers, and fight with us from the same cause. So he's saying, to rise up with us. Time to rise up and fight for your liberty. Rise up and fight for equality and fight with us to make this place a better place for us all. Talking to the slaves. And so he definitely was the main leaders of this. In fact, he was brought to the negotiation table, sent by negotiators from Napoleon when he takes control. And they capture him. So it's a very shady business where Toussaint Louverture near the end of the revolution's captured because of the negotiation, not upheld by the French side. He's taken back and he dies in captivity. Now, despite that, in 1804, a huge victory, they were able to take control. So the 500,000 slaves take control of the island. They end up renaming it. It's from the indigenous language, the Taino language, Haiti, which we know it as today, which means mountainous. It's a very mountainous area, and they brought it back to its original name, its original place of meaning, and declared Haiti as black, as equal. So they're bringing in the idea of equality for all, but to be a citizen, you had to be black. To be a landowner, you had to be black. No white person was allowed to have plantations. No white person was allowed to have the rights as a citizen, and no rights of owning plantations or any of that. And in fact, early in this, they called for them to leave. They said, it's good for you to all leave. Now, that is an important thing that we're going to get to, but the success of this revolt, 500,000 slaves, the leadership of Toussaint Louverture, his capture, but still been able to carry on with this revolution, to win, to use the Enlightenment ideals, to gain control of the most economic, prosperous island in the whole Caribbean, in fact, perhaps the whole Western Hemisphere. And this was hope for some. This was hope for those of the island, but word spread very quickly among slaveholding areas, that among the slaves and the slaveholders themselves, that this is happening in now Haiti. Now, for some, for the slaves held in the South, for the slaves held in other parts of the Americas, this was a hope to uprise. And songs, just like songs used from the Bible, from Abraham's, set your people free, and using that as a cry, now they're singing songs. Slaves are singing songs all over the Western Hemisphere, in slave communities, in slave regions, that there is hope, that Louverture is going to save us, that somehow that the revolution's going to catch fire from Haiti to other parts and we're going to be free. This is a new beginning. A new dawn has risen with this revolution. The life, liberty, pursuit of happiness is happening for the slaves in Haiti, and it'll happen for us as well. That's hope for some. But remember, this for the slave owners hearing this is the biggest, worst thing that could happen, and it's absolute chaos for them. So remember, Haiti becomes a different battle cry, not for freedom, but to remind slaveholders to hold on tight, to have strong control, to not let this event happen in the region. Now, the success of the Haitian Revolution also was really important in that how it affected the French government, who loses this territory, and in fact, most importantly, Napoleon Bonaparte, his government, because they'd really depended on the sugar and coffee that was exported to fund their military. Now, in 1800, while the event was going on, there was a secret deal between Spain and Napoleon that allowed him to get back the region that was lost from the 7 Years' War. Now, if you remember, after the 7 Years' War, it wasn't France that owned the region of just outside the United States into the North American region, but it was Spain. However, France got it back in 1800 with a secret deal. And so he was expecting, and really part of the plan was for his own expansion, was using Saint Dominique, using this new territory to have a strong hold in the Western Hemisphere. But he loses Haiti, and around the same time, he loses a major campaign in Egypt. And so he's feeling the blow. He's feeling the economic strain of his campaigns, and he's also doesn't see really the point of having this landholding in the Western Hemisphere. In 1802, the young United States new president, Thomas Jefferson, sends two officials, James Monroe and Robert Livingston, to meet with Bonaparte's government, to meet with officials about buying not the whole holdings of Napoleon, but buying New Orleans and Louisiana and part of Florida that he owned. To their surprise, Monroe and Livingston came back with news of the whole territory for $15 million. Of course, at that time was a lot of money, but this nearly doubles the land holdings of the United States of that time. And remember, the 7 Years' War, the whole idea was westward expansion into the Ohio Valley and into the region, and this allows for that. And we're going to talk about Jefferson in future lectures, and his important reforms was agrarian reforms, to get farmers to move for the individual property and the right to have your own land for all citizens was the idea, and this allowed for that to happen. But on the flip side of that, what happened in Haiti after the success of the revolution? It was great for the slaves that were now free, that were now citizens of this new country, upholding and creating a constitution, creating Enlightenment ideals as the foundation of a new country that emerges. And all the economic power and growth of the plantations that they have. But what about the slave owners? What about the whites there that weren't citizens, that didn't have rights? Well, they asked them to leave at first, but that led to a second part, a reckoning of the revolution, and what was known as the Haitian Massacre. Now, the French Revolution had its reign of terror after the successes of the French Revolution. The Haitian Revolution follows suit and has its own reign of terror. And after the capture and death of Louverture, you have the new head of this uprising, now country, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who orders the ethnic cleansing of all remaining white population. So very similar to the French Revolution's reign of terror, who starts killing everybody who's against political parties, but this is now killing all the remaining whites. They don't have rights as citizens, they don't have rights in this land, and they're seen still as a threat. So that creates a new reckoning and an ethnic cleansing. One of the most notorious participants and leaders of this ethnic cleansing, who was very fierce, it's very gruesome without too much detail, his name was Jean Zombie. He was a voodoo religious priest, person, and but he was also this leader that would very gruesomely would kill people, and this was stories were spread across the world, really, and in fact, definitely to the south into slave-owning areas of the United States, slave-owning areas across the Western Hemisphere, and you start to get stories being told like the boogeyman or like a zombie. And that's where we get this term zombie, of this dead person who's able to take on a life of its own and to create terror. And that's exactly what was told to, you could picture in in plantation owning communities that own slaves saying, look, you better watch out or the zombies will get you. Don't let the dead slave culture, don't let the dead take control, or they will wreak havoc and they will destroy you. So Jean Zombie and the terror that was created in the wake of the Haitian Revolution, the Haitian Massacre, this new reign of terror was a terror not only to the whites on the island, but it was a terror to all slave populations, slave plantation owning populations that saw this as a direct threat of what could happen in their own areas by their own slaves if they don't watch out. So in conclusion, what are these ingredients? Well, let's review those. First and foremost is a bedrock of Enlightenment ideals: personal liberties and a contract of government. And those need to align with each other. And if they don't, then that creates a spark to allow for revolution. Economic and social uprising allows for revolution. And we see that with the American Revolution, the French Revolution, both the American Revolution able to sort of hold on to a lot of the systems and things in place, not completely abolished, not have their own reign of terror like French Revolution does or the Haitian Revolution does, but the Enlightenment allowed for the same ideals to play out with these revolutions, with the Haitian Revolution and other revolutions in Latin America as well. Now, these revolution ideas become the groundwork that everyone's created equal, but there's the caveat of the slave economy. In Haiti, they were able to clear that out by eradicating all the white slave owners and the white people in a gruesome way. But what about the United States? And we're going to talk about that long route of abolition movement. But the French example is very clear as well. French abolished slavery with the French Revolution in 1794. That leads to the Haitian Revolution. That leads to that uprising. But also, they felt the strain economically with their other land holdings. Without slavery, they're not able to have their economic prosperity. They're not able to have the cotton that they have in their regions, the sugar plantations, the coffee plantations that fuel the French economy. So by 1802, they bring back slavery. The French plantations were suffering too much. And so on one side, they eradicate slavery because of the idea of everyone's created equal, but their economy would suffer too great. The United States would have a similar struggle between that. And so that would take decades before then of finally abolishing slavery, but only after a very gruesome war. So it's really important that revolution and Enlightenment ideals also forced hard questions on society. Yes, it's great to say all men are created equal, but when it comes to practice, when it comes to laws, and when it comes to the idea that there's a contract of the government to uphold those values for everybody, that then creates class tension, it creates racism, it creates gender issues, and it creates that struggle in societies that has its lasting effect, perhaps to the 21st century today.